Welcome to the debate. Today we are dissecting the explosive onset of World War II. We're looking specifically at the rise of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and their terrifyingly rapid dominance over Europe and Asia.
And the central question we are wrestling with is really one of causality.
Exactly. Was this early Axis success the result of an unstoppable, innovative, and, ideological force that simply outmatched the old world? Or was it, conversely, a catastrophe born of Allied paralysis, incompetence, and diplomatic cowardice? I'll be arguing the former, that the Axis powers were driven by a unique internal logic, a desperation for resources, and a ruthless modern efficiency that made their expansion almost inevitable.
And I'm going to take the opposing view. While the ambition of the dictators is clear, this wasn't a case of an unstoppable force. It was a case of the immovable object, the Allies, crumbling due to its own structural rot. From the diplomatic delusion of appeasement to the military obsolescence of the French army, the West essentially handed the keys of Europe to the dictators through sheer inaction.
The inaction is part of the story, sure. But if you only look at Allied weakness, you miss the sheer mechanical force of the regimes they were facing. You have to look at how these leaders manufactured power out of chaos. Take Mussolini. He didn't just inherit a stable state. He took a fractured Italy and synthesized a new political technology, fascism. He transitioned from a socialist draft dodger to a nationalist authoritarian because he understood that the Italian people were hungry for a revival of the Roman Empire, for identity over class struggle.
But was that genius, or was it just loud opportunism?
It was a singular drive. When he issued his ultimatum to the king in 1922, "Make me prime minister or I'll make me prime minister," that wasn't a bluff. That was a recognition of his own leverage. It's the same with Hitler. He capitalized on the stab-in-the-back myth, this idea that the German army was undefeated in the field during World War I, but betrayed by politicians at home. He weaponized the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles to create a movement that viewed him not just as a leader, but as a destined savior. Even Japan's aggression, well, it was a calculated response to unequal treaties and resource starvation. These were proactive, dynamic systems.
Dynamic, perhaps, but fragile. Look, my issue with the unstoppable force narrative is that it ignores how many off-ramps the Allies missed. You mentioned Hitler's rise, but that rise was conditional on the West looking the other way. We call it appeasement, but it was really active enabling. Chamberlain didn't just allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland. He handed it over on a platter in exchange for a signature on a piece of paper. He returned to London claiming peace for our time, which, it suggests a complete detachment from reality.
You think they could have stopped it just by saying no?
Absolutely. Look at the military state of the Allies. It wasn't that they lacked tanks or men, they lacked the mindset. France and Britain were so traumatized by the trenches of World War I that they entered a state of defensive paralysis. The French military was trying to fight a 1940 war with 1918 methods, relying on dispatch riders instead of radios because they feared interception, and refusing to fire artillery to avoid provoking a response. They were defeated psychologically before the first shot was even fired.
That technological gap is exactly my point, though. It wasn't just that the French were bad, it's that the Axis were innovatively adaptable. Mussolini and Hitler were political shapeshifters. Mussolini moved from an anti-war socialist to a pro-war interventionist the moment he saw that war could trigger revolution. They filled a vacuum. When democratic governments offered stagnation and bureaucracy, the Axis offered a restoration of greatness. They were playing a different game entirely.
I'd argue they were bluffing, and the West refused to call it. When Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, it was a huge violation of Versailles, but his secret orders were to retreat immediately if the French army showed up. The French didn't show up. Mussolini invaded Albania to dominate the Adriatic, and the West just watched. Japan staged the bombing of a train in Manchuria to justify an invasion, and, the international community just sent stern letters. The dictators weren't pushing down walls, they were walking through open doors.
I think bluffing implies they didn't intend to go through with it eventually. You have to understand the concept of Lebensraum, right? Living space. This was a core tenet of Nazi ideology, the economic and racial necessity of expanding eastward. They needed the resources of Europe and the Soviet Union to sustain their economy. Similarly, Japan's expansion into the Yangtze Valley wasn't an opportunistic probe. It was a systemic demand for resources like oil and rubber that they just didn't possess. They were on a ticking clock. Diplomacy couldn't fix a structural need for conquest.
But the timeline was accelerated by Allied incompetence. The Munich Agreement was the pivot point. When Chamberlain validated Hitler's strategy of demand and receive, Hitler immediately invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then, when war was finally declared after Poland, we got the phony war. 8 months where the great powers just sat around. The French launched a token offensive into the Saarland, advanced a few miles, and then turned back. They gave Hitler the one thing he needed most: time to reorganize his army for the strike on France. That wasn't Axis genius. That was a strategic gift.
Let's look at what they did with that time, though. The fall of France. This is where the argument for Axis modernity is strongest. The doctrine of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, wasn't just about moving fast. It was the integration of tanks, dive bombers, and radio communications to completely paralyze the enemy. They smashed through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French generals dismissed as impenetrable for tanks, with 50 divisions. They encircled the Allied armies not by overpowering them, but by outthinking them. That is a triumph of doctrine, not just a failure of the enemy.
It was a triumph of exploiting a lack of basic competence. The French built the Maginot Line, this massive fortification, but then stopped it at the Belgian border, assuming the Ardennes would do the job for them. Their command structure was so rigid that orders took days to even reach the front. You call Blitzkrieg a brilliant innovation. I call it the inevitable result of a modern army attacking a museum piece. Even the British response was anemic, dropping propaganda leaflets over Germany instead of bombs. An air marshal at the time admitted they likely served no purpose other than, well, providing the continent with toilet paper.
Yet the machine did stall. And I think the Battle of Britain actually supports my point about the internal logic of the Axis, specifically its volatility. The German military machine was formidable, but it was tethered to Hitler's ego. After a minor British raid on Berlin, Hitler flew into a rage. He ordered the Luftwaffe to switch targets from crippling the RAF airfields to bombing London's civilians. That emotional shift gave the RAF the breathing room to repair and reorganize. The very megalomania that built the machine eventually short-circuited it.
I disagree that it was just Hitler's error. I think that diminishes what actually stopped them. Active resistance. For the first time, the Allies showed some spine. The RAF had the doubting system, an integrated radar and communication network that actually outmatched the Germans technically. And the morale of the British people held. They didn't collapse under the bombing. It proved that when the Allies actually utilized their resources and refused to submit, the unstoppable Axis force could be stopped cold.
So, on one side, we have a terrifyingly modern force that reshaped the geopolitical landscape through industrial warfare and a violent dismantling of the Treaty of Versailles. Leaders like Hitler and Mussolini didn't just find openings, they created them through sheer ideological will.
And on the other, a cautionary tale of delay. From the diplomatic surrender at Munich to the military paralysis of the phony war, the evidence suggests the war became a global catastrophe because the democracies refused to recognize the threat until it was almost too late.
It seems we are looking at a deadly combination: insatiable dictatorial ambition meeting a catastrophic failure of democratic leadership.
Indeed. A complex tragedy requires more than one villain.
Thank you for listening to The Debate.